Today I'm offering an in-depth look at the closing voluntary for this coming Sunday, on which we are observing the Feast of All Saints. The postlude on Sunday is an extraordinary piece by the French composer Olivier Messiaen called L'Apparition de l'Église éternelle, or the Apparition of the Eternal Church. The word apparition usually connotes something appearing that is surprising or even frightening, and I wouldn't be surprised if many people might describe this piece of music as scary. But Messiaen didn't write this piece as an exercise in spooky composition. Rather, he conceived of this music as being awe-inspiring. It is meant to approximate a fleeting glimpse at divinity itself and the accompanying terror and ecstasy such an encounter would produce. This piece is constructed in an arc form. That is to say, it begins softly, grows gradually to an overwhelming climax, and then recedes back to a soft dynamic. I love the narrative that Messiaen scholar John Gillick gives for this piece. Imagine arriving on the Normandy coast in France near Mont Saint-Michel. This towering monument to the Christian faith barely visible in the distance. As we draw closer, the monastery and its spire, which sit atop this mount, become clearer and clearer, seeming to ascend up out of the sea. As we arrive directly in front of this shrine, imagining the incredible feat of its construction and also countless Christian pilgrims who have climbed to the top on their knees in homage, listening to the ceaseless waves that beat at the base of the edifice in an almost brutal way, an image of the eternal church looms up before our very eyes, magnificent, majestic, victorious. As we depart, always guarding this vision within our sight, this apparition slowly begins to fade away. As we draw farther and farther away, the image gradually disappears, now seemingly into the sea. But we are left with an unforgettable experience of awe and majesty. In that description, John mentions the ceaseless waves beating in an almost brutal way. This is represented in Messiaen's music by the bass line in the pedals, which ceaselessly throbs in this rhythm. Another way that Messiaen represents this ebb and flow of tension and release is through his use of harmonies. Messiaen invented different ways of organizing musical notes into specific scales, and he called these the modes of limited transposition. Here is a C major scale. This isn't one of Messiaen's modes, but it is the one that we all know best as a nice tonal world in which much of our popular and classical music lives. Here is the second mode, according to Messiaen, which we also know as the octatonic scale. In this mode, the notes alternate between being a half step apart from each other, or as close as one can possibly play on a keyboard, and a whole step apart from each other, which is when you skip a note on the keyboard. So this is what a scale sounds like in the second mode. In this organ piece, Messiaen also uses his third mode of limited transposition as well as his seventh mode. Here's the third mode, and here's what a scale sounds like in mode 3. And here's the seventh mode, which is kind of like two segments of a chromatic scale put together. Just to give you an idea of how changing modes affects music, let's take a listen to Happy Birthday in these different modes, starting on C. Here's the normal version that we all know and love. Here is that same tune, but played now in mode 2. slightly different, and now in mode 3. And finally, here it is in mode 7. So you can definitely hear that changing the mode really changes the mood of a tune. But sometimes setting these sorts of parameters, like saying, I'm only going to use these 8 specific notes in writing this piece, for example, could lead to much more creative compositions. All of that to say, you might hear lots of chords that sound wrong to you, or crunchy, as I like to call them sometimes. But just know that it isn't Messiaen churning out random notes or smashing the keyboard with his arms randomly. There is structure and thinking behind this music, I promise. Messiaen contrasts these especially crunchy chords and phrases with open fifths. A fifth is an interval that doesn't sound particularly happy or sad. It isn't major. It isn't minor. It's just open. In the context of this piece, the open fifths provide a sort of relief from all the tension in the chromatic, crunchy harmonies. Just have a listen to this passage and hear how the texture thins all of a sudden when I get to those open fifths, which are highlighted for you. So far we've discussed 2 representations of an ebb and flow in Messiaen's piece. We've got the incessant pounding bass rhythm in the pedals. We've got the tension and release of the harmonies that I just demonstrated. And finally, we have the arc of the dynamics in the piece, or how loud or soft it is. Now, on our Cassavant organ, most things sound pretty loud. There must be something about those Canadian organ builders and their tastes. Our starting dynamic in this piece is forte, which means loud. But the R, you see, tells us that we're only using stops on the Récit manual, which is just a fraction of the organ's full forces. And importantly, Messiaen advises that the swell box be completely shut. This makes the sound feel a bit muffled, because the pipes aren't able to speak directly into the room, with the swell shutters closed. From this muffled forte, through engaging more of the organ stops and by gradually opening the swell box, the piece grows and grows all the way to an astounding dynamic climax of quintuple forte, which is not an indication you see very often at all in music. And then after this climax, the piece gradually calms down, and by the end, it reaches a relatively very quiet pianissimo dynamic. I'm warning you now that on Sunday, when I'm playing at the organ here at the quintuple forte level, at the height of intensity within this music, I would advise you listen out in the room and not up here by me. I wouldn't say the volume is painful, but it is pretty intense, which is exactly what Messiaen wanted, that overwhelming sense of awe. Composers for the organ vary in how specific they are about which sounds on the instrument to use. But in this score, Messiaen is very prescriptive of what stops he wants on and off and when. I'm really pleased that on our Cassavant organ, which has its own French-Canadian accent, most of the time when the composer calls for a specific combination of sounds, we have them available here. So what on earth does this crazy piece have to do with All Saints, or remembering those who have left us? Well, there's a poem attached to this piece from Messiaen, which reads, "Made out of living stone, made out of heavenly stone, it appears in heaven. It is the Lamb's bride. It is the heavenly church, made out of heavenly stone, which is the chosen's souls. They are in God, and God is in them for heavenly eternity. So Messiaen is portraying this awe-inspiring, majestic building, a really grand church that is eternal and that is built out of the saints and departed souls. That rhythmic bass pattern I've mentioned a few times now not only could be described as the ebb and flow of waves in the sea, but also perhaps as the pounding of a hammer, as in the incessant rhythm of construction. So that's the connection to our remembrance of the dead. In our Western art, heaven can sometimes be portrayed as a very calm, serene place where everyone hangs out in fluffy bathrobes reclining on clouds. But Messiaen's version is slightly different in that it is overwhelming, awe-inspiring, and almost brutal. It reminds me of the passage from Exodus where Moses asks to see God in all God's glory. But God says that you cannot see my face, for no one shall see me and live. And Moses only sees God's back after God passes by. And even that experience is so intense that it causes Moses' face to shine afterwards. I should also note that Olivier Messiaen was an extremely devout Catholic. And the kicker to all of this amazing imagery and well thought out harmonies is that when Messiaen constructed this music, he was only 24 years old, which is pretty astonishing to me. So if you're here at Glenn to hear this postlude this coming Sunday for All Saints, just remember that it is not purely crazy random noise that might seem a bit rude to you, but rather it is a meditative piece. If you stay to listen, I suggest sitting well into the sanctuary, not too close to the front, so that the sound has a chance to mix in our room's acoustic, and perhaps try closing your eyes to focus on that repetitive and steady rhythm that you will hear in the pedals. I hope it transports you in some way. Thank you for your attention about this rather obscure piece of music, and I hope you find it interesting to listen to this coming Sunday on All Saints.